Hey, welcome back to the Nero world. Today we're diving into another Nero Wolfe mystery, smart, sharp, and worth every minute. The trouble with wealthy people is that they always arrive with the assumption that their money has preceded them and done the necessary introductions. The woman who stepped into the front hallway of Nero Wolfe's brownstone on West 35th Street that Tuesday morning in October had that particular brand of composure that comes not from tranquility, but from practice. The long, careful rehearsal of appearing undisturbed when you are in fact profoundly disturbed. I'd opened the door myself because Fritz was occupied with whatever Wolfe had demanded for his 10 o'clock pre-lunch interlude, and I had a moment to study her before she opened her mouth. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, handsome rather than pretty, with dark hair cut short and severe at the jaw. Her coat was charcoal wool, expensive, and she wore it the way wealthy women wear expensive things, without noticing them. Her hands, as she pulled off one glove, were cold-looking even before she extended one toward me. I took it. I was right. Cold. "Mr. Goodwin," she said. It wasn't a question. She'd done her homework. "That's the name on the door," I said, though it wasn't. "Come in." Her name was Lydia Croft. I knew that already because she'd telephoned the previous afternoon and spoken to Wolfe directly, a rare event, since Wolfe regards the telephone as an affront to civilized discourse. But he tolerates it for prospective clients, the way a surgeon tolerates the sight of blood. From what I'd gathered, listening to Wolfe's end of the conversation, which consisted primarily of monosyllables punctuated by two long silences, the matter concerned her husband, a man named Gerald Croft, who was either in serious danger or already dead. Wolfe had not elaborated afterward. He'd simply told me to expect her at 10 and gone back to his book. I showed her into the office, Wolfe's office, which occupies most of the ground floor rear of the brownstone and functions simultaneously as his command center, his throne room, and his fortress. The room is large and comfortable, in the way that rooms are when someone with strong opinions and unlimited resources has spent 30 years imposing those opinions on them. The furniture is mostly yellow, Wolfe's preference, and there are two globe chairs opposite the desk for clients. Bookshelves cover most of two walls. A large globe stands near the window. On the desk there is a vase, and in the vase, always, are orchids from the plant rooms on the roof, where Wolfe spends 4 hours every day, pursuing the closest thing to happiness he admits to. He was already in his chair when we entered. This is worth noting only because Wolfe's chair is not merely a chair, but an engineering achievement. Custom built to support his 1/7 of a ton, which is how I've always calculated his weight when I want to avoid the more alarming arithmetic. He was reading, and he did not look up immediately, which was his standard greeting, for new clients and head of state visitors alike. "Mr. Wolfe," I said. "Mrs. Lydia Croft." He finished his sentence. He always finishes his sentence, and then placed his book face down on the desk, with the careful reverence he reserves for books and orchids and nothing else. "Mrs. Croft," he said, "please sit." She sat. She had good posture, the kind that's structural rather than affected. She placed her gloves on her knee and her handbag on the floor beside her, and looked at Wolfe with the direct, evaluating gaze of a woman who had learned not to waste time. "You spoke with my husband's attorney," she began. "I did not," Wolfe said. "I spoke with you yesterday, at 4:17, for 11 minutes. You told me your husband was dead, and that you believed he had been murdered. You told me the police had concluded otherwise. You told me you wished to engage my services. You told me nothing else of consequence. I asked you to come this morning so that you could tell me everything." She blinked, just once, a small recalibration. "You're very direct." "I am efficient," Wolfe said. "There is a distinction. Begin wherever you like, but understand that I will stop you when you become imprecise." "I always have my notebook open." Lydia Croft drew a breath, organized herself visibly, and began. Gerald Croft had been her husband for 19 years. He was 61 years old, a partner in Croft and Ashburn, a private investment firm that managed money for a small, select clientele. The kind of clientele whose net worth has enough zeros that they stop counting and start using words like portfolio and exposure, the way other people use the weather as conversation. The firm had 4 partners: Gerald, a man named Douglas Ashburn, who was the co-founder, a younger man named Philip Renner, who had made partner 8 years ago, and a woman named Caroline Voss, who had been brought in 4 years ago to manage institutional accounts. Gerald had been found dead 3 weeks ago on a Thursday morning, in the private study of his home in Turtle Bay. He was seated at his desk. The medical examiner had determined the cause of death to be cardiac arrest. Gerald had a history of heart disease, a mild infarction 2 years prior, a stent procedure, the usual constellation of medical facts that make a man's heart an easy explanation for his death. "And you believe it was not his heart?" Wolfe said. "I believe," she said, "that someone helped his heart stop." "On what basis?" She opened her handbag. Organized woman, she'd come prepared. She produced a small envelope and placed it on Wolfe's desk. He did not touch it. He looked at it. "Gerald came home that Wednesday evening," she said. "We had dinner. He was not himself. He was agitated, but containing it. Gerald was a man who contained things. It was one of his primary skills and one of his primary faults. I asked him what was wrong. He said it was a business matter, and that he expected to resolve it within the week. He also said, and this is not something Gerald ever said, that if anything happened to him, I should speak with someone who knew how to find the truth." "He mentioned me?" Wolfe asked. "He mentioned you by name." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside, a bus ground its gears on 35th Street. "What is in the envelope?" Wolfe asked. "A key," she said. "It was in Gerald's desk, in the locked drawer. The police searched the room, but superficially. Once they had the cardiac determination, their interest diminished. I found it afterward. It's a key to a safe deposit box. I don't know which bank." "And you haven't investigated?" "I've been advised not to act precipitously." A brief, controlled tightening around her mouth. "By the attorney, and by Douglas Ashburn." "Who had a reason to advise caution?" "I don't know. That's one of the things I'd like you to find out." Wolfe looked at me. I looked back. It was one of those moments. "The envelope, Archie," he said. I picked it up, opened it carefully, and examined the key. Standard safe deposit, no bank name, numbered only. I put it back in the envelope and set it on my side of the desk. "Mrs. Croft," Wolfe said, folding his hands over his considerable midsection. "I will ask you several questions. Answer them precisely. Did your husband have any enemies? Not general adversaries, specific individuals who bore him focused ill will?" She considered. "Philip Renner. They'd had a serious falling out approximately 6 months ago. I don't know the details, but it was severe enough that Gerald moved Renner's name off the primary accounts." "Anyone else?" "Martin Hale. He was a client, former client. He lost a significant sum through the firm 2 years ago and blamed Gerald personally. There were legal threats." "Any tension there?" Something moved behind her eyes. "You know the firm's partners." "I know what you've told me in the last 11 minutes, Wolfe said. "I asked about Miss Voss." "Mrs. Voss," she said, "widowed. She and Gerald had a collegial relationship. I had no specific reason to distrust it." The emphasis on specific was doing considerable work, and we all knew it. "Very well," Wolfe said. He was silent for a moment, which with Wolfe is never an absence of thought, but rather the visible surface of thought in motion. Then, "My fee is $10,000 as a retainer, against daily expenses and a further sum contingent on result. If I determine your husband died of natural causes, I will tell you so directly, and refund half the retainer." Lydia Croft didn't flinch. She reached into her handbag and produced a checkbook. "I brought the checkbook," she said, "because I was fairly certain you would take the case." "I haven't taken it yet," Wolfe said. "But you will." She met his eyes steadily. Gerald said you never refused a case that affronted your intelligence. He said you were vain about your reasoning. Wolfe regarded her for a long moment. His lips pursed, which in his vocabulary of expressions means he's been said something that is both accurate and impertinent. He was not wrong, Wolfe said at last. Write the check. After she'd gone, I sat in the red leather chair and turned the key over in my fingers, while Wolfe returned to his book. Men who manage money for the very wealthy move in circles where my name occasionally surfaces, Wolfe said, not looking up. You think she's telling the truth? She's telling us what she believes to be the truth, which is a different and more complicated thing. He turned a page. Gerald Croft told his wife to contact me if something happened to him. Something happened to him. That is either a remarkable coincidence or the opening chapter of a deliberate design. And which do you think it is? He looked up then, briefly, with an expression that managed to convey both mild amusement and absolute certainty. Archie, he said, I do not believe in remarkable coincidences. Make the calls. I want Philip Renner, Douglas Ashburn, Caroline Voss, and Martin Hale here tomorrow at 2 o'clock. Tell them it concerns the estate of Gerald Croft, and that their presence is requested by the widow. And if they decline? Tell them whatever is necessary. You have a talent for creative persuasion that I find both useful and mildly alarming. I closed my notebook, pocketed the key, and picked up the phone. Getting 4 busy, suspicious, and in at least one case openly hostile people to appear voluntarily at a detective's office on 24 hours' notice requires a particular kind of phone manner, part confidence, part implication, part outright bluff. I've been doing it for years, and I've gotten fairly good at calibrating which lever to pull with which personality. Douglas Ashburn was easy. He called back within 10 minutes of my initial message, which told me he was either cooperative by nature or anxious by circumstance. He said he'd be delighted to help in any way he could. Men who say delighted in that particular tone are rarely delighted. They're calculating. Philip Renner was harder. He had a sharp-voiced assistant who told me Mr. Renner was unavailable, and I had to leave a message that referenced the phrase regulatory implications of the Croft estate before a callback materialized. Renner himself was clipped and cautious on the phone. The kind of man who regards every conversation as a negotiation for position. He agreed to come, but he wanted it on record, his word, that he was doing so voluntarily and without prejudice. I told him I'd noted in my diary. Caroline Voss was the surprise. She accepted immediately, with a warmth that seemed genuine, and asked if there was anything she should bring. I said just herself. She said she'd been wondering when someone would start asking questions. Martin Hale required 3 calls and a letter on Wolfe's letterhead, which I drafted in 10 minutes and had Fritz take by hand to Hale's building on East 58th. He called that evening. He was angry, in the particular way of men who are frightened, and using anger as insulation. He said he had nothing to say to Nero Wolfe or anyone else connected with Gerald Croft. I said that was fine, but that the alternative was a conversation with the district attorney's office, which was looking into certain aspects of the Croft firm's management practices. This was not true, but it was plausible, and plausibility is the working currency of most effective bluffing. Hale said he'd be there at 2. They arrived within 11 minutes of each other the following afternoon, which meant I was shuffling people into the front room and the hallway and the small sitting room off the hall with the efficiency of a man running a very tense theatrical production. Wolfe doesn't do group sessions in the introductory phase. He prefers to meet suspects individually first, to establish baseline responses before they've had the chance to calibrate against each other's stories. This was my job, to bring them in one at a time, observe them in the waiting period, and report back. I started with Ashburn because he'd been first and most eager. Douglas Ashburn was 64, lean and silver-haired in the way that certain men of his class and generation achieve, as though it's been professionally arranged. His suit was charcoal and impeccable. He had the kind of face that's been handsome for a long time and knows it. Not vain exactly, but accustomed to the advantages that certain features provide in business negotiations. He sat across from Wolfe, with his legs crossed and his hands loose in his lap, and radiated a controlled, practiced calm. "I appreciate what you're doing for Lydia," he said, before Wolfe could speak. "She's had a terrible time. Gerald's death we were partners for 31 years. You were business partners," Wolfe said. "Were you also friends?" A slight pause. "The way that men who work closely together are friends. We understood each other." "Did you like each other?" Ashburn smiled. It was a good smile, polished and available. "Most of the time." "Tell me about the firm's condition in the months preceding Mr. Croft's death." The smile held, but the eyes changed, a subtle flattening. "The firm is in excellent condition. I didn't ask about its condition now. I asked about the months preceding the death. There were some restructuring conversations, normal in any business of our complexity. What was Philip Renner's role in those conversations?" A longer pause. "Phil had some concerns about account allocation. It was resolved by moving him off the primary accounts, as I understand." Ashburn uncrossed and recrossed his legs. "Gerald made some personnel decisions in August. They were his to make." "And you agreed with them?" "I supported Gerald's judgment." "That is not the same as agreeing," Wolfe observed. Ashburn looked at him for a moment. It was the look of a man re-evaluating his opponent's capabilities. "No," he said, more carefully, "it isn't." We learned two things from Ashburn in that session, though he volunteered neither of them consciously. The first was that there was money trouble, not catastrophic, but serious, at Croft and Ashburn in the months before Gerald's death. The second was that Ashburn, whatever his surface urbanity, was deeply uncomfortable with questions about Philip Renner. Philip Renner was the opposite of Ashburn in almost every visible characteristic. He was 43, stocky, with dark hair worn slightly too long for his suit, and an energy about him that suggested he was always slightly more caffeinated than was strictly advisable. He sat in the client's chair, the way some men sit in a dentist's waiting room, occupying it grudgingly and with the clear intention of leaving at the earliest opportunity. "I'll be direct," he said, by way of opening. Men who announce their intention to be direct rarely are, but it's a useful signal of anxiety. "Please," Wolfe said. "I know how it looks. Gerald and I had a falling out. Then Gerald died. I understand how that reads from the outside." "How does it read from the inside?" Renner's jaw tightened. "From the inside, Gerald made a business decision that was punitive and personal and had nothing to do with performance. My numbers were excellent. My client relationships were excellent. He moved me off the primary book because I disagreed with a decision he and Ashburn made about the Meridian account." "What decision?" "A fund reallocation. 60 million moved out of a low-risk position into a higher-yield vehicle. The client, one of our largest, an institutional trust, wasn't fully informed of the risk parameters. I objected, formally, in writing." His voice had tightened another notch. 2 weeks later I was off the account. "Who made the decision on the Meridian account?" "Gerald and Ashburn, together." He said it the way you'd read two names on an indictment. "And Martin Hale's complaint? Was that connected to the Meridian account?" Renner went still. It was a different kind of stillness than Ashburn's, not polished, but frozen. "How do you know about Hale?" "I know many things," Wolfe said, which is one of his preferred mystifications. "Answer the question." Hale was a private client. He lost about 2 million on a tech position that Gerald recommended. That happens in investment management. Hale was furious, threatened litigation, but there was nothing actionable. Was there anything unactionable but true in his complaints? Renner looked at the floor for a moment, then up. "That," he said, "would depend on what you found in the Meridian file." He left me with the strong impression that he'd come here not primarily because I'd threatened him with regulatory implications, but because he'd been waiting for an opportunity to say that sentence to someone. Caroline Voss was perhaps 40, attractive in a professional, careful way, a woman who'd learned to modulate her appearance in male-dominated environments, not minimizing it, but managing it. She had brown eyes that were quick and specific in the way of people who process information rapidly and remember what they've processed. She sat down and said, "Gerald was murdered. I've thought so since the morning they found him." Wolfe raised an eyebrow, a quarter inch. For him, this is the equivalent of a standing ovation. "What led you to that conclusion?" he asked. Gerald had a mild cardiac history, yes, but he was genuinely careful about it. He had his medications precisely organized. I knew his system. I'd helped him set it up after his first event. He took a specific combination of medications each evening. The night he died, the medications were in a different order in his case. It sounds like nothing, but Gerald was obsessive about his routine. "Perhaps he was distracted that evening," Wolfe suggested. "Perhaps, but the larger thing is what he told me." She said it calmly, which made it more effective than if she'd said it with drama. "When did he tell you, and what did he tell you?" Wolfe asked. 3 days before he died, he came to my office at the end of the day. Not unusual. We often discussed accounts over the close. But that day, he didn't discuss accounts. He told me he'd discovered something in the firm's records that concerned him deeply. He didn't say what specifically. He said he was going to spend the week reviewing the documentation, and that he'd need to speak with me again at the end of it. She paused. He never got to the end of the week. "Did he indicate who was involved in whatever he'd discovered?" She held his gaze. "He said he wasn't sure he could trust his own judgment on it, that it was someone he'd trusted for 30 years. The room was quiet. "Douglas Ashburn," Wolfe said. "It wasn't a question." "I didn't say that," she said. "No, you didn't." Martin Hale was last, and he was the most difficult. He was 56, heavy-set, with the remnants of good looks, roughened by what I diagnosed as several years of sustained anger. He sat down, refused coffee, and said, "I'm here under duress, and I want that understood." "Noted," Wolfe said. "Mr. Hale, you lost approximately $2 million on a recommendation made by Gerald Croft." 2.3, Hale said, "and it wasn't a recommendation. It was a managed position. He had discretionary authority. He put my money into a position without telling me, and it collapsed." "Did you investigate the circumstances of the collapse?" "I hired a lawyer. The lawyer said it was within the parameters of the management agreement. Technically." The word technically had a bitter edge. But it wasn't something Gerald would normally do. He was conservative. That was his whole pitch. Steady, careful, no surprises. Something changed his approach? Or someone? Hale looked at his hands. "Look, I'm not saying I know what happened, but I've been in business for 30 years. When a man's behavior changes overnight, there's a reason. Either he's scared of something, or he's in something, and he needs the returns to cover it." "And which do you believe was true of Croft?" Hale looked up. "Both," he said. "I think both things were true, and I think someone at that firm knew it and used it, and when Gerald finally figured out the extent of it, that was a problem for someone." After they'd all gone, I brought Wolfe his 4 o'clock beer and sat in the red chair with my notes spread on my knee. "Impressions?" he asked. "Ashburn is hiding something, and is very good at it. Renner is angry, and is using the anger to say things he can't say directly. Voss knows more than she told us, and decided exactly what to tell us and what to hold. Hale is a man with a legitimate grievance, who may also have had legitimate motive." Wolfe drank beer and regarded the ceiling. "The medication," he said. "Caroline Voss's observation, the order of the pills." "A small thing," he said, "which is precisely what makes it interesting. Large things can be fabricated or imagined. Small, specific things of no apparent consequence, those have the texture of truth." He set down the glass. "Find the safe deposit box, Archie. That key is the center of this." I spent Thursday morning working the banks. There are, by one estimate, several hundred bank branches in Manhattan. A safe deposit key without a bank name is an exercise in elimination. But it's not as hopeless as it sounds if you approach it methodically and you have the right kind of charm for bank managers. I started with the financial district and worked uptown. The key was from a mid-sized private bank on East 47th, the kind of institution that doesn't advertise, but maintains its clientele through longevity and discretion. The branch manager, a careful man named Fowler, confirmed after examining the key and consulting his records that the box was registered to Gerald Croft. He examined our documentation. I'd had Lydia Croft sign a letter of authorization the previous evening, and after 20 minutes of legal consultation with someone on his phone, he showed me to the vault. The box contained 4 items. The first was a USB drive, labeled in Gerald Croft's handwriting, Meridian, full record. The second was a bound sheaf of papers, printed emails, approximately 40 pages, flagged with yellow tabs. The third was a single sheet of notepaper, on which Gerald had written, in a careful hand, what appeared to be a financial summary with 2 columns of figures. The fourth was an envelope addressed to Lydia, sealed, with "open only if something happens to me," written across the flap. I photographed everything with my phone before touching anything, then carefully bagged each item separately, returned the box to Fowler with appropriate thanks, and went out to the street, where I called Wolfe. "Come home," he said, and disconnected. Back at the brownstone, Wolfe examined each item in sequence with the methodical attention of a man who reads the same way he eats, with total focus and zero tolerance for interruption. The letter to Lydia we opened with her present. She came over that afternoon, sat in the client's chair, and held the envelope in her lap for a moment before she opened it. Gerald's letter was 3 pages. He'd written it 11 days before his death. I won't reproduce it in full, but the essential content was this. Gerald Croft had discovered, approximately 6 weeks before writing the letter, that a systematic and sophisticated fraud had been operating within Croft and Ashburn for at least 3 years. Money had been moved from client accounts through a series of transactions designed to obscure the flow, routed through subsidiary vehicles, recharacterized as fees, reinvested in positions that consistently underperformed, and were then unwound at convenient moments. The beneficiary of these maneuvers, based on Gerald's reconstruction of the records, was a holding entity he'd traced to a shell company in Delaware. He hadn't yet determined who controlled the shell company, but he'd narrowed it. He told Lydia he loved her. He told her he was sorry for the weight of what he was about to expose. He told her to trust Caroline Voss, who he described as honest and courageous. He told her, if the worst happened, to go to Nero Wolfe. Lydia read the letter without expression, which is one of the bravest things I've seen anyone do. When she'd finished, she folded it carefully and placed it back in the envelope. "He knew," she said. "He suspected he was in danger," Wolfe said. "He was being appropriately cautious." "He should have been more cautious." She said it without anger, just as a flat and irreversible fact. "Mrs. Croft," Wolfe said, and his voice had that quality it occasionally achieves, a kind of massive gentleness, like something very heavy being set down with care. "Your husband was a brave and thorough man who was trying to do the right thing. He also, I suspect, could not quite believe that someone he had trusted for 30 years had done what the evidence was showing him. That disbelief cost him time." She nodded once. Then she gathered herself and asked what happened next. What happened next was that Wolfe spent the rest of that afternoon and most of the evening with the documents. I brought him dinner at his desk, which he accepted without registering the concession it represented. Wolfe, eating at his desk, is the behavioral equivalent of a general abandoning his headquarters to sleep in the field. He was focused. By 10 o'clock he had the shape of it. The fraud was real, sophisticated, and had been running for approximately 3 years. The Meridian account had been the primary vehicle. $60 million managed on behalf of a family trust, moved through a sequence of transactions that individually looked like routine portfolio management, but collectively constituted a systematic siphon. Martin Hale's account had been a secondary vehicle, smaller but consistent with the same pattern. The money was moved in parcels through a management fee structure that overcharged by precise amounts that fell beneath standard audit thresholds. The difference, approximately $4 million over 3 years, had been routed to the Delaware shell. The shell company's name was Obsidian Capital Consulting LLC. I thought that was worth noting. When I said so to Wolfe, he said, "Yes, note it." "Someone has a taste for dramatic naming," I said. "Or a taste for opacity. Obsidian is black glass, opaque and hard. A reasonable metaphor for a vehicle designed to be impenetrable." "Does the name connect to any of our suspects?" "Not obviously, which means we need to look less obviously." He pushed back from the desk. Philip Renner discovered the Meridian irregularities, or part of them, and objected. That is why he was removed from the account. Whether he understood the full scope, I doubt. He saw an anomaly and named it, which made him inconvenient. But not dangerous enough to kill? Apparently not. Or perhaps killing Renner would have raised more questions than it resolved. A partner in his 40s dying unexpectedly creates a different profile than a 61-year-old man with a cardiac history. So Gerald was the convenient death, I said. It came out flat and ugly, as it should. Gerald was the necessary death. He had found the full record. He had it documented and secured. And he had made clear, to Caroline Voss at minimum, that he intended to act on it. He pressed his fingertips together. But here is what troubles me, Archie. Just one thing? He ignored this, which was fair. Gerald told Caroline Voss he'd discovered something that involved someone he'd trusted for 30 years. That points clearly to Ashburn, his partner of 31 years. And yet Ashburn, whatever his calculations, does not strike me as a man who murders. He is a man who protects himself through institutional mechanisms, legal, financial, procedural. Murder is a different category of action. It implies either desperation or a particular coldness of temperament. You think someone else killed Gerald? I think, Wolfe said, that the person who designed the fraud and the person who ensured Gerald's silence may not be identical, or they may be. I need more information. He picked up his book. Tomorrow, Archie, go to bed. I went, but I didn't sleep easily. There was something moving at the edge of what we knew. Something about the medication, the order of the pills, the small specific detail that Caroline Voss had noticed and no one else had. Small things have the texture of truth, Wolfe had said. I kept thinking about what kind of person rearranges a dead man's pill case. Wolfe called them back. This time it was not optional, and this time he saw them together, first in pairs, then all four, a structure I'd seen him use before, when he wanted to watch the chemistry of confrontation. He believes, with some justification, that people reveal more in reaction to each other than they do in isolation. He started with Ashburn and Voss, which was a choice I noted without comment. Douglas Ashburn came in looking composed, and left looking considerably less so, though he managed to maintain the architecture of his composure throughout. Caroline Voss came in with a quality of quiet readiness, like a person who has been expecting a specific conversation and has prepared accordingly. Wolfe placed them side by side in the client chairs, which forces a kind of intimacy that neither of them had chosen, and opened without ceremony. "Mrs. Voss," he said, "you told me yesterday that Mr. Croft indicated the individual he'd identified was someone he'd trusted for 30 years. Mr. Ashburn, I'd like you to understand that statement's implication, and tell me whether it is accurate." Ashburn's expression did not change visibly, but something behind it shifted. Like furniture moving in a dark room, you hear it rather than see it. "I don't know what Gerald may have said to Caroline. He told her he'd discovered a serious irregularity in the firm's accounts, and that it involved a long-trusted colleague. You were his partner for 31 years. Are you aware of any irregularity in the firm's accounts?" "Absolutely not." The Meridian account. The reallocation you and Mr. Croft agreed upon 18 months ago. The management fee structure attached to that account. Are you familiar with the precise fee calculations? I don't personally manage fee calculations. That's administrative. Indeed. Wolfe turned a page of the document before him, Gerald's printed records. The Meridian account was overcharged in management fees by an average of 0.23% per quarter for 12 quarters. The total overage routed through the fee structure to a vehicle called Obsidian Capital Consulting amounts to slightly over $4 million. Were you aware of this? Ashburn said nothing for 3 seconds. In a courtroom, 3 seconds is an eternity. That is a very serious allegation. It is not an allegation. It is a number derived from Gerald Croft's own analysis of the firm's records, which he documented thoroughly and placed in a secure location before his death. Wolfe looked at him with the steady, impersonal attention of a man examining a specimen. Were you aware? I was not. And then, after another beat. But I would like to see those records. I'm certain you would, Wolfe said. Mrs. Voss? You told me Mr. Croft's medications were in a different order than usual on the night he died. How did you know the usual order? She didn't look surprised by the pivot. I helped Gerald set up his medication system after his infarction. He was orderly about it. Monday through Sunday pill organizers, each compartment organized in a specific sequence. Blood thinner first, then the beta blocker, then the aspirin. He said the sequence helped him confirm he'd taken them all. And on the night he died? I saw the case the following day, at the house. Lydia had left it on the desk. She hadn't moved anything. The aspirin was first. It's a small thing, but Gerald didn't do small things carelessly. Who else knew his medication routine? She paused. I did, Lydia certainly, his physician, and, she stopped. And? Wolfe prompted gently. Gerald had a habit of taking his evening medications at his desk before leaving the office. I'd seen him do it many times. Anyone who worked late at the office would have seen it. Ashburn looked at the floor. Wolfe nodded once and dismissed them. Renner and Hale together was a different kind of chemistry. Two men with legitimate grievances, both of whom had lost something to the firm, and neither of whom liked being in the same room as the other's reminder of what that felt like. Renner was sharper than his first appearance, as if the intervening day had convinced him it was time to commit. I want to tell you about the Meridian objection, he said, before Wolfe had fully settled. Please, Wolfe said. I noticed the fee anomaly 14 months ago. I brought it to Gerald directly, in writing. He thanked me and said he'd look into it. 2 weeks later, I was off the account. 6 weeks after that, Gerald came to me privately and said he'd made a mistake in dismissing my concern, and that he said he was looking into it more carefully. He apologized to you? I said, because it seemed worth confirming. Not in so many words. Gerald didn't apologize, but he acknowledged that I'd been right to flag it. He also told me, and this I didn't understand at the time, that I should keep my own records of any communications about the Meridian account, and not store them only on the firm's servers. He was warning you, Wolfe said. In retrospect, yes. At the time, I thought it was just Gerald being careful. Renner's jaw worked. I didn't know he was in danger. I should have. You couldn't have known, Wolfe said not ungently. Mr. Hale, you have information you haven't yet shared. Hale looked up from his hands. He'd been sitting in a contained, volcanic way, listening with the attention of a man who doesn't trust himself to speak. My money, he said, the $2.3 million. I said it was in a tech position. That's what Gerald told me. But after Gerald died, I had my own accountant pull the records. The tech position was real, and it did collapse. But the original amount invested in that position was $1.8 million, not $2.3. $500,000 went somewhere else before the position was opened. Wolfe was very still. And did you determine where? Partially, it went through a sub-account I'd never authorized. It was characterized as a strategic allocation vehicle. It was held by a company called Obsidian Capital Consulting. Wolfe said. Hale stared at him. How did you know that? Because, Wolfe said, your experience is consistent with a pattern, and patterns, Mr. Hale, are what we need to understand. Hale, are what a methodical thief cannot avoid creating. After they'd gone, Wolfe sat for a long time without speaking, which for Wolfe means he is building something. The shell company, I said. Obsidian. We need to trace the ownership. Yes, that is your task for tomorrow. I have contacts who can assist with the Delaware registry. Use them. I also want you to speak with Gerald's physician. I want to know exactly what medications he was taking, and whether any of them, combined with any common substance, could produce a cardiac event that would be indistinguishable from natural causes. I looked at him. You think he was poisoned? I think his heart stopped at a convenient time for someone. I think the medications were disturbed post-mortem, perhaps to retrieve something, perhaps simply out of confusion or panic. I think a man who prepared extensively for the possibility of his own murder was in fact murdered. He picked up a pen and turned it in his fingers. What I do not yet know is exactly who is connected to Obsidian Capital Consulting, and until I know that, I cannot assemble the complete picture. What's your instinct? I asked. He gave me a look that communicates reliably, that he considers the word instinct intellectually impoverished. My reasoning, he said, with careful emphasis, suggests that we have been looking at this as a case with one architect. I am beginning to believe there are two. I like the city in the morning, before it has fully committed to being difficult. October in New York has a particular quality of light, clear and slightly ruthless, stripping away the softness and leaving everything with very sharp edges. I started with Gerald's physician, a Dr. Emmett Raines, who practiced from a building on East 72nd, and had the manner of a man who's spent 40 years being careful with his words, and has gotten very good at it. He was reluctant until I explained with appropriate precision that we were investigating a potential wrongful death, and that the alternative to his cooperation was a formal subpoena in the context of a proceeding that would be considerably more disruptive to his schedule. This is not a threat I'd necessarily have been able to execute, but it has the right shape of something that could be, and Dr. Raines, being intelligent, recognized that. Gerald's cardiac medications included, among others, a beta blocker and an anticoagulant. Dr. Raines confirmed both. He also confirmed, when I asked directly, that certain medications, when combined with a sufficient dose of potassium chloride, for example, could produce a rapid cardiac event that might, in a man with Gerald's history and the absence of any reason to look for it, pass as natural. The potassium would metabolize quickly. Standard autopsy toxicology screens without specific cause for suspicion would not necessarily flag it. I asked if the ME standard toxicology panel would have caught it. He was quiet for a moment. Then, if they tested specifically for elevated potassium, and if the sample was taken soon enough after death, possibly. But standard tox panels don't typically focus there unless there's a reason. There wasn't a reason, I said, because no one was looking for murder. He nodded uncomfortably. The ME's report said natural causes. Given the history, and without flagged concerns, he stopped. You're suggesting someone who knew his medications would know what to combine them with. I'm suggesting it as a possibility worth examining, I said carefully. Would you say that a person with medical knowledge, or simply very thorough research skills, could have identified the vulnerability? Unfortunately, Dr. Raines said, yes. The Delaware registry was less dramatic, but ultimately more productive. Wolfe's contact, a meticulous woman named Fran, who operates a research service and has access to the kind of corporate databases that the general public doesn't know exist, had the Obsidian ownership chain broken down to its third layer by noon. Obsidian Capital Consulting, LLC, was owned by a holding entity called Kessler Group Holdings, registered in the Cayman Islands. Kessler Group Holdings had a single managing member, listed as an individual trustee for an undisclosed beneficiary. The trustee's name was a law firm, which is the corporate equivalent of a hall of mirrors. But Fran was good. The law firm had filed certain documents with the Delaware Secretary of State that required a named individual, a procedural requirement they tried to minimize but couldn't fully obscure. The named individual was a partner at the law firm, and the law firm had represented, among other clients over the past decade, Croft and Ashburn. The partner's name was Marcus Henley. I called Wolfe from the sidewalk. "Marcus Henley," I said, "lawyer, connected to the firm." A pause. "Interesting," Wolfe said. "Does the name appear in Gerald's documents?" I thought back through the printed emails. Once, Gerald's email from 8 weeks before his death. He was asking Ashburn whether Marcus Henley had been consulted on the Meridian restructuring. And Ashburn's reply? "That's one of the flagged pages." Ashburn said yes, Henley had reviewed the fee documentation and confirmed it was within standard parameters. So Ashburn knew Henley was involved in the fee structure. Which doesn't prove Ashburn knew about Obsidian, I said, playing devil's advocate, because Wolfe likes having his reasoning challenged, at least when it confirms rather than undermines. "No," he said, "but it suggests he had reason to know and chose not to know, which is a specific kind of culpability." He paused. "There is something else. This afternoon, try to find where Caroline Voss was on the evening Gerald died. You like her for this." I like no one for anything as yet. But she volunteered information about the medications in a way that was very precisely calibrated. She told us what she knew. She did not tell us how she knew the medication order had changed unless she saw it herself. Which means she was at the house after Gerald died. I want to know when. I spent the afternoon on that. Lydia Croft confirmed when I called her that Caroline Voss had come to the house the morning after Gerald's death. She'd come immediately upon hearing the news, brought flowers, stayed for an hour. She'd been in the study. Yes, you would have seen the desk. Yes, the medication case was there. So Voss had a legitimate reason to have seen the case. That checked out. But Lydia also mentioned, after a pause in which she seemed to be deciding whether to say something, that Caroline had come to the house once before, 2 days before Gerald's death, in the early evening. Gerald had been out. They'd spoken briefly. Caroline had left. "Did she say why she'd come?" I asked. "She said she had papers for Gerald from the office, but Gerald told me later that night that he hadn't been expecting any papers." I thanked Lydia and sat on a bench in a small pocket park off Lexington and thought about that. A person with a key could leave something in a house. A person with access to the office could know someone's medication routine. A person who recommended trust in Caroline Voss could have reasoned that putting suspicion on Ashburn and away from herself was the most effective misdirection available. I called Wolfe again. "I have a thought," I said. "Share it," he said. "What if Voss is the architect and Ashburn is the mechanism? What if she set up the fraud, using the firm's infrastructure and Ashburn's authority on the accounts, and kept herself out of the direct chain? What if Gerald's note about someone he'd trusted for 30 years was her deliberate misdirection? She told us that, Wolfe. She chose to tell us that detail." A long silence. "It is a coherent hypothesis," Wolfe said. But it does not account for the fact that Ashburn has no evident financial connection to Obsidian that we found. If he was the mechanism, he should have received proceeds. Unless he's the dupe," I said. "Unless he made the operational decisions, the Meridian reallocation, the fee structure, at someone else's direction, without fully understanding what the money was being routed into." Another silence. Longer. "Come home," Wolfe said. "I need to think." Wolfe spent Friday in the plant rooms. I know he thinks up there. He says he tends his orchids, but the tending is mechanical for him by now. The feeding, the repotting, the precise temperature management that Theodore Horstmann handles anyway. What Wolfe does in the plant rooms is think without the obligation of appearing to think. I've learned not to interrupt except for emergencies, and I've developed a reasonably robust threshold for what constitutes an emergency. At 6 o'clock he came down, went to the office, and sat for 20 minutes in complete silence, while I read the newspaper and pretended not to watch him. Then, Archie. The question is not who controlled Obsidian. The question is who had the expertise to create it. I lowered the paper. Go on. Obsidian is a sophisticated financial construction. 3 layers of corporate structure, Cayman entities, a nominee trustee. This is not the work of someone who learned corporate law from a book. This requires either a skilled attorney or someone with sophisticated knowledge of offshore structures, or both. He pressed his fingertips together. Marcus Henley is the attorney of record. But attorneys do not typically create such structures for their own benefit. They create them for clients. Who was Henley's client? The filing just shows the law firm. The law firm represents the client. But someone instructed the law firm to create Obsidian. Someone paid those legal fees. Someone specified the structure. He looked at me. Henley reviewed the fee documentation and confirmed it was within standard parameters, according to Ashburn. But did Henley also design the fee structure that routed the overage? You're saying Henley could be the architect. I'm saying Henley could be the instrument through which the architect operated. Someone at Croft and Ashburn had a relationship with Marcus Henley that preceded the fraud. Someone used that relationship to construct the vehicle and route the money. I went to my desk and pulled up the emails again. I'd photographed everything from the safe deposit, and I'd been through the stack 3 times, but I went through it again. 17 emails between Gerald and Ashburn over the last year. 4 between Gerald and Renner, including the written objection about Meridian. 3 between Gerald and a client liaison. And then at the back of the sheaf, 6 printed emails that I'd noted, but not fully analyzed, because they seemed administrative. They were between Gerald and the firm's outside counsel office. Routine correspondence, billing, annual compliance reviews, routine except for one. An email from 14 months ago, in which Gerald asked the compliance coordinator to send him the full history of the firm's outside counsel relationships, including any conflicts of interest disclosures. The response was a list, and on that list, disclosed as a potential conflict, but marked as waived, was this. Marcus Henley, Henley & Stroud LLP, has an existing advisory relationship with Caroline Voss, personal capacity, financial structuring consultation. Disclosed per ABA Rule 1.7. Conflict waived by written consent of all parties, dated 18 months prior. I read it twice to make sure I was reading it right. Then I picked up the phone. Wolfe, I said, Caroline Voss hired Henley 18 months ago, personally, for financial structuring consultation. Silence. 6 months before the Obsidian filing, I said. More silence. Archie, he said at last. Yes? Call Mrs. Croft. Tell her we will need one more meeting. Call the 4 suspects. Give them Saturday at 11. Tell them it is mandatory. And if they ask why, tell them Nero Wolfe is prepared to name Gerald Croft's murderer. Saturday morning I arrived at 9 to find Wolfe already at his desk, which is extraordinary, and Fritz looking anxious in the kitchen doorway, which is the reliable indicator that something unusual is afoot. Wolfe is not a man for whom Saturday morning means anything different from Tuesday afternoon, but he has a before confrontation quality that Fritz has learned to read, a heightened stillness, a more than usual precision in his movements, a tendency to eat his breakfast very slowly and very deliberately. I had coffee and went over the arrangements. 4 suspects, plus the client, Lydia Croft, plus, at Wolfe's instruction, Inspector Kramer of the NYPD Homicide Division, who had been informed the previous evening that Nero Wolfe was in possession of evidence material to the death of Gerald Croft, and would be presenting his findings at 11 o'clock Saturday morning. Kramer had said several things in response to this, the printable portion of which was that he'd be there. Kramer and Wolfe have a relationship that resembles a long marriage, decades of cohabitation around the shared business of violent death, each deeply familiar with the other's methods and temperament, neither particularly disposed to admit to any warmth about it. Kramer sits in the red leather chair when he visits. He's the only person besides me who does. I think Wolfe allows it, because Kramer's authority is useful. And because Kramer, for all his exasperation, is honest and not stupid. He arrived at 10:45, took his chair, accepted coffee, and regarded me with the expression of a man who's been summoned to a performance he expects to find impressive despite himself. "He's got something," he said. It wasn't a question. "He's got everything," I said. "Have you got someone who can pick up Marcus Henley?" He looked at me sharply. "Henley the lawyer?" "That's the one." He made a call. "Talk," he said to me. I gave him the abbreviated version: the fraud, Obsidian, the Henley connection to Voss, the probable cause of death. He listened without interrupting, which is a sign he's taking something seriously. When I finished, he sat with it for a moment. "The ME's report said natural causes," he said. "The ME's report was based on incomplete information. We can petition for a supplemental toxicology, specifically for potassium chloride. It degrades fast, but the sample was taken within hours. There may be enough." Kramer looked at the ceiling. "If Wolfe's right." "He's right," I said. "He's not always right. He's right more often than anyone else in this city, and you know it." He made a sound that wasn't quite agreement and wasn't quite denial, and finished his coffee. The four suspects arrived within 15 minutes of each other. Ashburn came first, still composed, but with something stretched beneath the composure now. He'd been given time to think, and thinking had evidently not improved his outlook. Renner came second, wary and watchful. Hale came third, radiating the contained energy of a man who suspects he's about to see something he's waited 2 years to see. Caroline Voss came last. She was perfectly dressed, as before. She nodded to Wolfe, nodded to Kramer, a slight hesitation at Kramer, which she controlled immediately, but which I caught, and sat in the chair I indicated. Lydia Croft sat to one side, near the window, slightly apart from the others. She'd asked to be present. Wolfe had agreed, with the stipulation that she remain silent throughout. She'd agreed immediately, with the kind of controlled calm that I was coming to understand was her fundamental mode of grief. At 11 o'clock exactly, Wolfe set down his pen and looked at the assembled room. "Thank you all for coming," he said, with exactly the amount of graciousness that the phrase conventionally requires. "I will be brief where brevity serves, and thorough where it is required. Gerald Croft was murdered. He did not die of natural cardiac causes. He was killed by the deliberate introduction of a substance that precipitated a cardiac event in a man with a known vulnerability. The substance was potassium chloride, administered in sufficient quantity, probably through his evening drink, which he customarily prepared himself in the study, to produce the event." The room was quiet. Hale's hands gripped his knees. Renner looked at the floor. Ashburn looked at Wolfe. Caroline Voss looked at nothing in particular. "Over the course of this week," Wolfe continued, "I have established the following chain of facts. A fraud was perpetrated against certain clients of Croft and Ashburn over approximately 3 years. Money was routed through a shell company called Obsidian Capital Consulting. The creation of Obsidian required sophisticated legal and financial expertise. That expertise was provided by an attorney named Marcus Henley, who had a prior personal engagement with one of the firm's partners for financial structuring consultation. He looked at Voss. She looked back, still composed, still presenting nothing. "Mrs. Voss," Wolfe said, "you designed the fraud. You engaged Marcus Henley privately, before any connection to the firm, to construct the vehicle. You then leveraged your position at the firm to route funds through the Meridian account, using the fee structure as the channel. You required operational authority that was above your own. The account decisions needed a partner's signature. You identified Douglas Ashburn as a useful instrument." Ashburn made a sound. "Mr. Ashburn," Wolfe said, without looking away from Voss, "I do not believe you knew the full design. I believe Mrs. Voss presented the Meridian reallocation to you as a legitimate and advantageous restructuring. I believe she provided you with Henley's review, which she had obtained, and which Henley had provided as a favor to his client as confirmation of legitimacy. You signed what she put in front of you, as partners routinely do when presented with legal confirmation. I didn't know, Ashburn started. I know you didn't, Wolfe said, which cut him off more effectively than argument would have. When Philip Renner raised his objection, that created a problem. You communicated Renner's concern to Mrs. Voss, probably as a routine matter of partnership management. She recognized that Renner's scrutiny could unravel the structure. She recommended removing him from the account. You agreed. Renner's head came up slowly. You were used, Wolfe told him, and then removed when you became inconvenient. You were not killed because removing you was sufficient. Gerald Croft, however, was a different matter. Wolfe let the silence sit for a moment before he continued. He does this not for dramatic effect. He would reject the characterization, but because he believes important information deserves the space to be absorbed. Gerald Croft, Wolfe said, was methodical, thorough, and ultimately honest. When Philip Renner's objection alerted him that something in the Meridian account warranted scrutiny, he did not act immediately. He investigated. Carefully and privately over several weeks, he reconstructed the fee routing, identified the Obsidian vehicle, and began to trace the ownership chain. He paused. He did not yet know who controlled Obsidian. But he had a strong suspicion, and he communicated that suspicion, unwisely, though understandably, to the person he was beginning to suspect. Just slightly, a small adjustment of her posture, a recrossing of her ankles, controlled. But it was a response, and response is information. He told you, Wolfe said to her directly. He came to your office, as you confirmed to me, and told you he'd found a serious irregularity and that it involved someone he'd trusted. You recognized that he had not yet identified you specifically. You had time, perhaps a week, perhaps less. You used that time. You came to the Croft house, I said, because Wolfe had given me the cue with a slight shift of his eyes. 2 days before Gerald's death. Lydia was not home. Gerald was not home. You had access. You knew the house, as a colleague of long-standing would. You left something. Possibly you prepared something. The potassium solution is not difficult to acquire or prepare with basic knowledge. I have no medical knowledge, Voss said. It was the first thing she'd said. Her voice was steady, which impressed me technically, even as I found it chilling. Potassium chloride does not require medical knowledge, Wolfe said. It requires a rudimentary understanding of cardiac pharmacology, a chemistry reference, and patience. The substance is sold commercially as a salt substitute and in laboratory supply. The fatal dose for a man of Gerald's weight and medication profile, with a known cardiac history and a beta blocker in his system, is calculable from publicly available medical literature. He looked at her without expression. You are an intelligent woman who has demonstrated the capacity for sophisticated financial engineering over 3 years. I do not underestimate your research capabilities. This is speculation, Voss said. Much of it, at present, is inference, Wolfe acknowledged. Inspector Kramer will petition for a supplemental toxicology analysis of the preserved biological samples from Gerald Croft's post-mortem examination. Potassium chloride degrades, but not instantly. There is a reasonable prospect that elevated chloride levels will confirm the mechanism. He looked at Kramer. Kramer nodded, once. Additionally, Wolfe continued, Marcus Henley is being interviewed at this moment by detectives of Inspector Kramer's division regarding the creation and management of Obsidian Capital Consulting. Mr. Henley is, I expect, a man who values his license to practice law above his loyalty to a client who has implicated him in fraud, and now, in the circumstances surrounding a homicide. He will have significant incentive to be forthcoming. Voss looked at her hands for a moment. It was the first time she'd looked away from Wolfe. In my experience, that's the moment. Not the dramatic protestation, not the sudden collapse. Just the moment someone looks away, because looking at the person who has seen through you becomes physically untenable. The medication case, Wolfe said, more quietly now. You came to the house after Gerald's death, legitimately, to offer condolences. You saw the medication case. You noticed the order was wrong, because you had replaced the pills in the wrong order when you prepared the potassium solution. You added it to his drink, but you also, perhaps as additional insurance, or perhaps from an abundance of caution, tampered with the pill case. You got the order wrong because you knew the order intellectually from having observed him at the office, but muscle memory is different from observation. He let that sit. And then, Wolfe said, you told me about the medication case in your first interview, unprompted. He tilted his head very slightly. That was the error that confirmed everything else. Voss looked up. Why would telling you be an error? Because, Wolfe said, if you had nothing to do with Gerald's death, the order of his pill case would be a small, sad detail you noticed. It would not, in ordinary consciousness, rise to the level of a clue worth volunteering to a detective. He gently paused, letting the silence stretch and the moment sink in. You volunteered it because you needed me to know that the routine had been disturbed, to establish that something was wrong, without understanding that the very specificity of your knowledge pointed toward you. You told me he was obsessive about his routine. You described the sequence with perfect accuracy. You presented it as evidence of murder, without understanding that it was also evidence of your own presence at the scene of preparation. He folded his hands. You made one other error. You directed my attention to Douglas Ashburn, repeatedly by implication, by the phrase about someone trusted for 30 years. You wanted me to build a case toward Ashburn. But Ashburn, for all his complicity in the operational mechanics, had no financial connection to Obsidian. A man who participates in fraud for personal gain leaves financial traces. Ashburn left none. The only partner at Croft and Ashburn with a financial connection to Obsidian was you, through Marcus Henley, through Kessler Group Holdings. He paused. You are the sole beneficial owner of Obsidian Capital Consulting. $4,230,000. It is a considerable motive. The room was quiet for a long moment. Philip Renner broke it first, not with words, but with a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more ragged. The sound of a man who has spent 14 months being angry about the wrong things, finally getting the right target for his anger. Martin Hale said nothing. He looked at Caroline Voss with an expression that was beyond anger. It was the expression of a man for whom the mystery of his loss has finally resolved into a human face. Douglas Ashburn sat very still, processing what it meant to have been an instrument you didn't know was in someone else's hand. Lydia Croft, by the window, looked at nothing. Kramer stood. He crossed the room to where Voss sat and stood over her in the way that Kramer has, solid, patient, official. Mrs. Voss, he said, I'd like you to come with me. She stood. She looked at Wolfe. You can't prove the potassium, she said. I can prove the fraud, Wolfe said, which carries its own substantial penalties. The toxicology may or may not add to the charge, but the fraud conviction, combined with the evidence of your personal relationship with Henley, the timing of Obsidian's creation, and the financial trail, that is what will occupy a jury for the first week. Whether the second week focuses on murder or on the question of what Gerald Croft knew and when you knew he knew it, is a matter I leave to the prosecutor's considered judgment. She held his gaze for another moment. Then she nodded, once, a small, precise motion that might have been acknowledgment or might have been something else entirely, and went with Kramer. The room let out a collective breath. I went to the sideboard and poured Wolfe his post-session beer, which Fritz had anticipated and left chilling. He accepted it and drank with the deliberate satisfaction of a man who has finished a difficult piece of work. Hale stood, looked at Lydia, and said, I'm sorry about Gerald. He meant it, which was worth something. Renner stayed a moment longer. He looked at Wolfe. The Meridian account, the clients, will they be made whole? That will depend on the bankruptcy proceedings, and whatever civil recovery is possible from the Obsidian accounts, Wolfe said. The assets were presumably not spent as fast as they were acquired. There will be recovery litigation. You might consider making yourself available as a cooperating witness. Your documented objection, filed 14 months ago, will be relevant. Something in Renner's settled. Not resolved. There was too much damage for full resolution, but settled. He left. Ashburn was last. He stood, looking diminished, which is a remarkable thing to observe in a man who had entered the room seeming so architecturally self-possessed. I should have known, he said, to the room in general, to no one specifically. Perhaps, Wolfe said, but the capacity to deceive is not evenly distributed among people. She was more sophisticated in deception than you were in its detection. This is, unfortunately, a common disproportion. Ashburn put on his coat and left without another word. And then it was just Lydia Croft by the window, and Wolfe at his desk, and me with my notebook. She turned from the window. In the October light, she looked like what she was, a woman who had held herself together by sheer will through 3 weeks of grief and doubt, and the particular difficulty of being right when everyone official is telling you you're wrong. Gerald put her name on the trust recommendation, she said. In his letter, he said to trust Caroline Voss. He wrote that letter when he first began to suspect something was wrong, Wolfe said. At that point, Mrs. Voss had given him no specific reason for distrust. She was, in every visible respect, his most honest and capable partner. His recommendation was based on the information available to him at the time. He was wrong. He was deceived. There is a distinction. Wolfe looked at her steadily. Gerald Croft was a thorough man, a brave man, and an honest man. He identified a fraud and documented it at personal risk. He died because he was those things. Being deceived by a sophisticated deceiver is not a failing of character. Lydia Croft held his gaze for a long moment. Then she nodded, the same small, precise nod that Caroline Voss had used, though the meaning was entirely different. "Send me your bill, Mr. Wolfe," she said, and left. After Fritz had cleared the beer glass, and the room had resumed its ordinary quality of organized stillness, I sat in the red chair, and made my final notes. "The medication detail," I said. "You said from the beginning that small things have the texture of truth." "I said they have the texture of truth," Wolfe said, correcting the implicit imprecision, "which is not identical to being true. What I recognized was that Mrs. Voss had given him no specific reason for distrust. Voss's precision about the medication order was too specific for innocent observation. She named the sequence, she named the specific pills. She identified the deviation with the confidence of someone who had engaged with the routine directly. And the misdirection toward Ashburn was elegant, Wolfe said, and there was something in his voice that, briefly, might have been a kind of professional admiration. Not for the murder, for the architecture. She constructed a situation in which the obvious suspect was a man with access, motive-adjacent behavior, and 30 years of partnership with the victim. She even placed herself in the position of the honest whistleblower, the person who tells the detective what she noticed, who cooperates, who said she has been wondering when someone would start asking questions. It was well done. Just not well enough. "Nothing is well enough," he said, "when someone is paying sufficient attention." He opened his book. "Good night, Archie." I looked at the clock. It was barely 4 in the afternoon. "It's 4 o'clock," I said. "Then good afternoon," he said, without looking up. I straightened my notes, pocketed my notebook, and let him read. Outside, the city was doing what cities do. Indifferent, enormous, in motion, full of people managing their secrets and their truths, in the ratio that suits them. Somewhere in it, Caroline Voss was being processed through a system that would take its time arriving at consequences, the way it always does. Somewhere, Marcus Henley was having a difficult conversation with detectives that would get more difficult before it got easier. And in the brownstone on West 35th Street, Nero Wolfe sat with his book and his orchids and his fourth of a ton of organized intelligence. Having done what he does, found the thread, pulled it, and unraveled the design. I put on my hat and went out into the afternoon. Some days the city feels like an honest place. This was one of them.